Hello, my name is Connor. Today I would like to pose the question, does the British state enforce xenophilia? Probably the easiest way to define this term is by its antonym, which is xenophobia, which is the fear or hostility towards people that are different from you, specifically foreigners, but it can also apply to just any kind of outsider or somebody or something that's deemed strange. There's a lot of people throughout history have expressed xenophobia, but there's only a few examples of that becoming kind of state doctrine. And those examples really are the fascist regimes of the 1920s and 30s. And they had a very restricted definition of what constituted not just the nation, but also a healthy nation. Tended to exclude ethnic minorities, but also people who didn't fit the mold, basically including gay people, transsexuals, and the disabled as well. More specifically in the case of Nazi Germany. It's the best known example of essentially a xenophobic regime. These regimes were characterized by totalitarianism, a particular form of authoritarianism, a very strong state which enforced its own ideas of, what was best for the nation. And I'm certainly not a fan of this type of government. It seems to me very oppressive. And most people in the West, and I think also the world generally, feel the same way. But somehow, I think in a lot of Western countries, we seem to have ended up going so far away from xenophobia and towards xenophilia instead, which is the sort of embracing people that are different, that somehow we're starting to see the same sorts of authoritarianism, though not quite, as in fascist regimes. The evidence that I'd provide for this is the fact that in this country, if you say things that are deemed to be hostile towards outsiders, like if you're a native Brit, basically, in a racial sense, or if you have an issue with people who are not heterosexual, just like the norm sexually, you can be convicted for it. And it's getting to the point where it's becoming more, the authoritarianism is increasing. I don't know if it's quite at the level of totalitarianism yet, because that usually also includes a cult of personality around a dictator and things like that. And that's not quite how it works here. We still don't have that. But it's starting to resemble this kind of thing. So I just wanted to take you through where this has come from, why this is the case. Best way to understand it would actually be to go back to the 18th century. And the fact that you had a lot of these non-conforming Protestant sects coming up. And they were discriminated against by the state, sort of working on behalf of the Church of England and things like that. And they advocated for themselves and their right to worship in the way that they wanted to and so on. And, they managed to get that kind of recognition as Protestants. But by the 19th century, other groups that were considered even more distant, in the sense that they weren't Protestant and sometimes not even Christian, started to demand the same sort of thing. And those two groups in particular were Catholics and Jews. By advocating for themselves, they managed to achieve emancipation. The two sort of landmark acts were the Catholic Relief Act of 1829 and the Jewish Relief Act of 1858. And this enabled Catholics and Jews to fully participate on an equal level with British Protestants. Yeah, this was just the state of things then for about, over 100 years. Around about that time, especially following the Second World War, Brits witnessing the horrors of Nazi Germany, particularly, the Holocaust and so on, the decision by the British government, a Labour government, which is quite relevant to the argument that I'm making, they allowed the immigrants from the Commonwealth countries, so ex-colonies, to come to Britain. And they seem to have underestimated the amount of people that took up this offer. And a lot of the people from these colonies were not white. And this was the cause of some conflict in British society. And it culminated in the 1965 Race Relations Act, which basically made it illegal to discriminate against anybody based on their race or ethnicity in public. The trajectory set by this act has only continued since then, in the past 60 years, to become ever more authoritarian, ever more restrictive over expressions, opposition towards, the concept of xenophilia, and criticism of what members of outside, usually minority groups might do, So let's say members of certain minority groups are overrepresented in certain crimes. There's different ways to interpret this, but sometimes emphasizing this and then providing a specific interpretation which doesn't fit a certain kind of left-wing orthodoxy can give you a conviction. Now, this 1965 Act was closely followed by a similar act in 1967 concerning sexual offences. And this is the first time that buggery, as it's known, it's an older term for anal sex, was legalised under certain conditions. This is the first step in the so-called gay rights. And it worked in tandem with the xenophilia agenda, I suppose you could call it. Because gay and trans and all of these kind of people, they're not outsiders or foreigners in the racial or ethnic sense, but they are outsiders in a sexual sense because most people aren't gay or trans. So I would definitely count them under this, and their advocacy movements have also tended to be associated with the left. And it's helpful to kind of give you an idea of the philosophical underpinnings of why this kind of legislation was brought in at this time. Because in the universities in particular, you had the emergence of two distinctive strains of thought. The first one I want to mention is postmodernism. In particular, the philosophy of Frenchman Michel Foucault. And one of his ideas was that society basically discriminates against people that don't fit the norm. One of the examples that he gave was what we now call neurodivergent people. So people who don't think like most other people. He was also gay. So it makes sense as to why he would have seen things this way. Himself feeling alienated from mostly straight society. The thing, though, with the postmodernists, mostly French, they were mostly apolitical. Foucault was quite famously pessimistic about the prospects of political activism. But that didn't mean that the students or readers of postmodernist works didn't factor that into their own politics. And I think this would have applied particularly to the left-wing ones because left-wing students and professors and so on, they were the most likely to be activists at this time, sort of mid to late 20th century, and still are. That's why I think it's important to mention the other branch, which is the Frankfurt School, mainly based in America after having to flee the Nazis. in 1934. But particularly the thinker, that I like to pick on Herbert Marcuse because of his concept of repressive tolerance, which is that basically in a capitalist society, you're going to get the Nazis and another Holocaust if you do not show intolerance towards right-wing opinions. And the interesting thing about this is that this idea, he wrote for an essay that was published the same year as the Race Relations Act in this country, 1965. It could be a coincidence. I don't know if it influenced that act. It probably just reflected the overall mood in the Western intelligentsia, I suppose. The point with all of this would be that we who are members of the majority, whether it's the majority and also native ethnic group in this country, and also the sexual majority, straight people, I think that we would best, obviously while maintaining tolerance and even acceptance of people that are different, to not embrace xenophobia, to certainly not embrace fascism or National Socialism or any of this totalitarian nonsense. At the same time, enforcing our boundaries with these outsiders or minorities or what have you, to allow them their own spaces where they can be what they are, but not interfere with us or try to make us adhere to their values and ideas, which I think is the case at the moment. But of course, the irony is that it's not. There certainly is members of these minority groups who are trying to enforce this on the majority. But in fact, the most prominent, I think, people trying to enforce this xenophilia in our society are members of the majority groups, racially and sexually. I don't think it's working. I think it's authoritarian. I think it goes against the British values of personal freedom. Let me know what you think, and I will speak to you again soon. Thank you for watching.